And welcome to segment 2 of the metric system, where we're going to continue working with the pattern that we produced already. It's the ones, tens, hundreds, and thousands. And we talked about the cube rod flat pattern that repeats over and over again. And now we're going to talk about how that pattern repeats going in the other direction with smaller units. So if we want to make smaller units, we have to break down this little tiny little cube. So it's too small to really break down. So what I could do is I could make the picture much bigger, but then it gets all kind of blurry. So what I'm going to do for our purposes is I'm just going to say, okay, I'm going to introduce that. I've just taken this one, I'm blowing it up so it's larger so that we can now easily break it down. So if I take this little tiny cube, which now looks like this, just so that we can make it easier to see, and I divide it up into a series of flats. I'm going to have 10 of these flats make up a cube, just like 10 of these flats made up a cube. So now these flats, we're not going to call them flats anymore. We're not going to call them hundreds anymore. We're going to have a new name for them. So we call these tenths. Now, if I take this flat and I cut it up into 10 pieces, I'm going to end up making a rod, just like if we took this flat and make it into 10 pieces. So I'm going to bring up a rod, but we don't call those rods anymore. We don't call them tens anymore. These now become 100ths, because it takes 100 of these rods to make up one of these cubes. It takes 10 of these to make a flat, and 10 flats, that's 100 rods to make up a cube. That's why we call them hundredths. And then the last one we're going to have, if I take that rod and cut it up, I get it into a little cube. And that little cube we're going to call a thousandths, with the THS on the end of it, because it takes 1,000ths of these little guys to make one of these cubes, which is just one of these one place values cut up into really small pieces, so it's just easier for us to see. So I just want to point out that we can see that cube, rod, flat, cube, rod, flat pattern that repeats over and over and over again. In following our pattern that we had here, we call these 1 times 10s, so these would be 1 times 1/10. The 100th would be 1 times 1/100th, and the thousandths would be 1 times 1/1000th. So when we talked about the different ways of naming them, we talked about how the Greeks might name them, and so this system works on the same idea. So when we talk about big things, we had deca, hecto, and kilo. These are very similar, except these are called decis, and DEC, they're both tens. Okay. Then it gets changes a little bit. The hundredths are centis, which is named after the French for cent, which is 100. This is where we get the idea from a century from. Then we have milli, which is French for 1,000, and this is 1/1000th of our original base units. So let's say that we had 3 of these regular ones cubes. And we're going to talk about how many of these little guys we have. So we're just going to blow this up so it looks like this. So we got 3 of these cubes. How many of these tenths flats would we have? Well, that would be, it would take 30 of these decimeters to make one regular meter. It takes 10 to make one of these, and then we have 3 of these cubes, so therefore we need 3 sets of 10, which would be 30 decimeters. How many hundredths would it take? Well, it takes 10 to make one of these, and another 10 to make these, so it takes 100 rods to make each one of these. So how many rods would it take to make 3 of these? It would take 300 of those rods. But instead of saying 300 rods, we're going to say 300 centimeters. And how many of these little guys would it take? Well, it takes 1,000 of these to make one of these cubes. We have 3 of these cubes, so therefore it's going to take 3,000 of those little tiny cubes. But instead of calling them little tiny cubes, we're going to call them millimeters. So it would take 3,000 of these millimeters to make 3 of the regular 1 cubes.